Welcome back, listeners. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to the golden age of Hollywood, the 1940s. A world of glamour and, well, a darker side we don't often see. And we're going to deep dive into a case that really embodies that, the unsolved murder of Georgette Bauerdorf.
A story that, it really does capture that kind of dark side of the silver screen.
Yeah.
On the surface, you have this vibrant young woman embracing the Hollywood scene, but then beneath all that, this chilling mystery starts to unfold.
And the material you sent me really highlights that contrast. We've got police reports, witness statements, even newspaper clippings from back then.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
I think what I find really striking is how Georgette's story kind of reflects the complexities of that whole era.
Right.
You have this young woman striving for independence, but still facing those societal expectations of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You have the backdrop of World War II, and this social scene that, well, often blurred the lines between, reality and illusion.
Totally. So let's start with Georgette herself. We know she came from a wealthy family in New York, but she wasn't content with just a life of, well, privilege. She wanted something more.
Absolutely. She was drawn to the allure of Hollywood, that chance to make it big, that dream of becoming an actress.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the war broke out, her patriotism really came to the forefront. It became this driving force in her life.
Yeah, it's interesting how both her personal aspirations and this sense of duty kind of intertwined.
Oh, completely.
And that's where the Hollywood canteen comes into play.
Yeah.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, it was this amazing place. Imagine, like, this bustling nightclub.
Oh, yeah.
Where servicemen could, dance with movie stars, escape the realities of war for a bit.
A true haven for them.
And Georgette wasn't just, attending these events. She's a dedicated volunteer.
Absolutely. One of the hostesses there. And she really went above and beyond to make those young men feel welcome. She'd dance with them, talk to them, offer a kind word, even extend her generosity outside the canteen walls.
And her generosity, I think that's really a key part of this story.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, she would give soldiers rides home, treat them to meals, even let some stay at her apartment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it shows how kind she was, but it also makes you wonder.
Yeah. Did her kindness, did it make her a target?
Yeah. Did she trust the wrong people?
It's a tragic thing to consider, but crucial to understanding, what happened to her.
Right. So now let's move to October 11th, 1944, the night of the murder. This is where the puzzle starts to take shape, or really fall apart. Georgette had spent the day, kind of an ordinary day, with her father's secretary, Rose Gilbert. Shopping, lunch, even a trip to the beauty salon.
Right.
They even talked about Georgette going to visit her new boyfriend, a soldier stationed in Texas.
I read about that. And it's just, that contrast is so stark. Rose described her as being in good spirits that day. Happy. Healthy.
Hey.
It just makes the violence of what happened that night even more shocking.
Yeah. And later that night at the canteen, we have this account of the sources call him a dark and husky soldier who kept pestering Georgette to dance.
I remember that.
Even though she clearly wasn't interested.
It definitely makes you wonder if that encounter was somehow connected to, what happened later.
Right.
Yeah.
It's unsettling. Around 11:30 p.m., she left the canteen, drove home alone to her apartment at the El Palacio.
Mm-hmm.
It all seems so normal.
And that's what makes it even more chilling. The idea that danger can be lurking, even in the most ordinary moment.
Yeah. The discovery of Georgette's body the next morning is where everything really changes. Lulu Atwood, a maid at the El Palacio, she found the front door unlocked, heard water running,
Oh, man.
and then walked into a scene that would make headlines across the country.
It's a truly gruesome image to find her like that, lifeless in the bathtub, her face submerged in the water, blood. It instantly dispels any idea that this was just an accident.
Yeah. And initially, the police did think it was an accident, that maybe she slipped, hit her head.
Right.
But then they noticed something odd. The light bulb outside her apartment door. It was unscrewed, just enough to disable the motion sensor.
Huh. That's interesting.
And that one little detail, it changes everything.
It really does. It implies that someone was trying to, cover their tracks, and it completely shifts the focus of the investigation.
Right. It's like something straight out of a detective novel.
Yeah.
And as the police kept investigating, they found more and more evidence that pointed to foul play, like a washcloth stuffed in her mouth, bloodstains in the bedroom, her purse dumped out on the floor.
It's a chaotic scene.
It is.
It tells a story of a struggle, someone trying to silence her,
Right.
and maybe even searching for something.
But her valuable jewelry, other items, they were all left untouched.
It's curious, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Doesn't really fit a robbery gone wrong scenario.
No, not at all.
And then the autopsy report. It paints an even more disturbing picture. Georgette was strangled, sexually assaulted, had a number of injuries. A far cry from that initial theory of a slip and fall.
The brutality of it is just, it's shocking. And the details in that report are just, they're horrific. Bruises, signs of a struggle, it's just awful.
And it's heartbreaking to think about the terror she must have felt. And to make things even worse, one of her neighbors reported hearing a woman screaming in the early morning hours, "Stop! Stop! You're killing me!"
Oh, wow.
He thought it was just a domestic dispute, but, well, it's chilling to think those could have been Georgette's last words.
Bad. It's a tragic layer to this story. Not only was she murdered, but her cries for help, they went unanswered. It really makes you think about, the responsibility we have to each other.
Yeah. It's a heavy thought. So as the investigation was going on, the police focused on soldiers from the canteen, especially that dark and husky soldier who'd been bothering her earlier. But that lead, well, it went nowhere.
It seems like a logical starting point, given her connection to the canteen and, her kindness toward servicemen. But it's frustrating that despite all the potential suspects there, they hit a wall.
Yeah. They had fingerprints, cigarette butts, even Georgette's diary detailing her social life. But nothing seemed to lead them to the killer.
So much evidence, but no clear path forward. That's got to be incredibly frustrating for the investigators.
And then, just when the investigation seemed to be going cold, a former Navy seaman named John Sumter walks into the FBI office in San Francisco and confesses to Georgette's murder.
Wow. Out of the blue.
Yeah, just like that.
That must have been a shock for the investigators after weeks of dead ends to suddenly have someone claiming responsibility.
Right. But as they dug deeper into his story, it just didn't add up.
Oh.
It became clear that Sumter's confession, it was all a lie, driven by his own issues. He even had a magazine article about the case in his pocket. It seems like he was more interested in attention than actually being guilty.
It's a sad story. A man struggling with his own demons, using a tragic case to get noticed.
It really is.
I wonder what happened to him after that.
He was held on a vagrancy charge and likely sent to a psychiatric ward.
It's just, it adds another layer of tragedy to this whole case.
It does. And then, as if things weren't strange enough already, a few months later, a schoolgirl found a note, typewritten, confessing to Georgette's murder and promising that the killer would show up at the Hollywood canteen on the anniversary of her death.
Whoa. That's pretty dramatic.
It is.
It almost seems like someone was trying to, turn Georgette's murder into some kind of public spectacle.
I know, right? The police dismissed it as a hoax, though, and they never found out who wrote it. But this case wasn't done with its twists and turns.
Oh, there's more.
There is. Because now enters Henry Lynch, the self-proclaimed citizen investigator.
Okay. Now this is getting interesting.
This guy was obsessed with the Bauerdorf case, spending hours collecting evidence, hanging around Georgette's old apartment building.
Wow. Sounds like a real-life detective story.
He was. The police were a little suspicious of him at first, of course, but eventually they determined he was just an eccentric hobbyist with a passion for solving crimes. They let him go with a warning to stay away from the El Palacio.
It's fascinating how these cases can capture the public's imagination to the point where people get involved like that.
Yeah, it's like it speaks to that human desire for answers, for justice.
Totally. And it kind of foreshadows the whole, armchair detective phenomenon we see today.
Right. It's a reminder that, that interest in true crime, it's not new. It's been around for a long time.
Absolutely.
So Lynch didn't lead to anything, but the police did have one more lead to chase down. In 1950, they arrested a man named Chester Vukas. He was suspected of strangling a young woman in L.A.
Okay.
And the similarities to Georgette's case were, they were pretty striking.
Another possible connection, that must have been a huge development for the investigators.
It was, but then they found out Vukas would have been only 16 when Georgette was murdered.
Oh, wow.
And while that's not impossible, they thought it was unlikely. And soon after, Vukas was acquitted of the other murder charge.
So another dead end. It just underscores how difficult these cold cases can be.
They really are. Time just, It makes things so much harder.
It does. Evidence deteriorates, memories fade. It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Exactly. And so, despite all the evidence, all the suspects, all the hours spent investigating, the case of Georgette Bauerdorf went cold.
A stark reminder that, well, that justice isn't always guaranteed. And some mysteries, they may never be solved.
But Georgette's case wasn't completely forgotten. Years later, rumors started swirling about a possible link to another infamous Hollywood murder. A case that, well, it shocked the nation.
You're talking about the Black Dahlia, right? Elizabeth Short.
I am one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history, and some believe there might be a connection between the two.
That's an interesting theory.
It is.
What makes them think that?
Well, the prime suspect in the Black Dahlia case, a guy named George Hodel, he had medical training and access to surgical instruments,
Okay.
including the type of elastic bandage used to strangle Georgette.
Oh, right. I remember that detail from the autopsy report. It's definitely chilling to think that the same person could be responsible for both of these horrific crimes.
It is.
But is there any, like, solid evidence to support that theory?
It's definitely a possibility, but there's nothing concrete linking him to Georgette's murder.
Mm-hmm.
And the Black Dahlia case itself is still officially unsolved.
So while it's possible they were the work of the same killer, there are also, pretty big differences between the two cases that make it hard to say for sure.
Exactly. The Black Dahlia case was about spectacle, about shocking the public. Georgette's, well, it felt more personal, maybe a crime of opportunity or misplaced trust.
Right. It's a subtle difference, but an important one.
It is.
It makes you wonder, though, if there are other unsolved cases from that era with similar patterns, connections that we just haven't uncovered yet.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
It is. It's like we're piecing together this giant puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and we might never have the full picture.
Right. And that's part of what makes these cold cases so compelling. They really challenge us to confront, the limits of our knowledge, the fact that some questions might never be answered.
Exactly. And yet the desire to understand, to find the truth, it never really goes away.
So that brings us to, I guess, the big question. What happened to Georgette Bauerdorf? After all these years, is there any hope of ever finding her killer and bringing justice for her family?
Honestly, it's hard to say. Cold cases are notoriously difficult to solve, especially when so much time has passed.
Yeah.
But you never know. New technology, a fresh perspective, these things can change everything. Like, look at what DNA testing has done for cold cases.
Right. I mean, who knows what advances in forensic science might be able to do for Georgette's case?
It's a glimmer of hope, for sure.
It is. But even if the killer's never found, telling Georgette's story, it keeps her memory alive.
You're absolutely right. It's a reminder that, behind every unsolved case, there's a human story, a family that's still searching for answers.
Yeah. And it's a reminder to all of us to be aware of our surroundings, to look out for each other.
Yes, absolutely.
If you see something suspicious, say something. You never know. You could help prevent another tragedy like this.
I think that's such an important message to emphasize.
It is. So to our listeners, what do you think about this case? Any details that stand out to you? Maybe something we talked about sparked a memory or an idea.
Sometimes even the smallest detail can be the key to solving a mystery. And even if we can't solve it ourselves, we can keep telling these stories.
Exactly. And hope that someday justice will be served.
I agree.
Now, it's amazing to me how a case with so much evidence, so many potential suspects, could just go unsolved for so long. What do you think prevented the police from cracking this case back in the 40s?
Well, for one thing, forensic technology was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. Fingerprinting, for example, was much less sophisticated, and DNA testing didn't even exist.
Right.
So those limitations definitely made it harder to identify the killer.
And then there's the whole social context of that time. We're talking wartime Hollywood, a world of secrets, scandals, and where protecting reputations was paramount.
Oh, yeah. The power dynamics in Hollywood back then, the studio system, those things could have really hindered the investigation.
Exactly. Witnesses might have been scared to come forward. Influential people could have buried information that might have hurt their image.
Absolutely. It's crucial to consider that aspect when looking at this case.
It is.
And it's also possible that certain pieces of evidence were just overlooked or misinterpreted. Maybe there's something buried in those police reports that seemed insignificant at the time, but with our modern understanding of forensics, could be really important.
Yeah. A fresh perspective can make all the difference.
It really can.
And we have to remember, we're only seeing a part of this story. Through these sources, there could be other information out there that we just don't know about. Witness statements that were never made public, redacted police reports, personal letters, diaries.
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There could be so much more beneath the surface.
Exactly.
And maybe, just maybe, that missing piece is out there somewhere.
It could be.
Just waiting to be discovered.
So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive into the murder of Georgette Bauerdorf, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this story?
I think it's important to remember that Georgette Bauerdorf was more than just a victim in an unsolved case. She was a young woman with dreams and a life full of potential. Her life was tragically cut short, and her story deserves to be remembered.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it.
We should never forget her story.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that behind every unsolved case, there's a real person and a family that's still searching for answers. And that the pursuit of justice, it should never end.
I couldn't agree more.
So, if you have any information, any detail from Georgette's story that sparks something for you, please reach out.
You never know. Your insight could be the key to unlocking this mystery.
And for all of our true crime fans out there, if you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure you're subscribed to the deep dive for more stories like this one.
We'll have plenty more for you.
Until next time.
Keep those detective minds sharp. It was driven by his own inner turmoil. He even had a magazine article about the case in his pocket, like he'd been, carrying it around with him.
Right. And he even admitted that he wanted to die, but he was afraid to commit suicide. So he confessed, hoping he'd get the death penalty.
Wow, that's really heavy.
Yeah, it's a sad story. It really is.
It is, and it makes you think, sometimes even in a murder investigation, the real story is about someone who's just crying out for help.
Yeah, you're right. And as if things weren't strange enough, right? A few months later, a schoolgirl finds this note. It was typewritten. And it confesses to Georgette's murder.
Full confession.
Yeah. And it even promised that the killer would appear at the Hollywood Canteen on the anniversary of her death.
Okay, now that's straight out of a movie.
I know, right?
Like, who does that?
I have no idea. But the police, they dismissed it as a hoax, never found out who wrote it.
Huh.
But the case still had a few more surprises up its sleeve.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. Because now we have to talk about Henry Lynch, the self-proclaimed citizen investigator.
Okay, now this is getting interesting.
This guy, he was all about the Bauerdorf case. Spent months collecting evidence, hanging around her old apartment building.
Wow. Sounds like you really went down the rabbit hole.
He did. And of course, the police were a little wary of him at first, but they determined he was just, well, an eccentric hobbyist, passionate about solving crimes.
I guess you could say he was ahead of his time, like a prototype for all those, armchair detectives we see today.
Right. It's interesting to think about how this case, and others like it, really capture people's imagination. The desire to solve the puzzle, to bring justice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a basic human need to try and make sense of things, especially when something so senseless happens.
So Lynch was a dead end, but the police did have one more lead to pursue. In 1950, they arrested a man named Chester Vukas. He was suspected of strangling the young woman in L.A.
Okay, another possible connection.
Yeah, and the similarities to Georgette's case, they were, pretty striking.
So did they think they finally had their guy?
It seemed promising at first, but then, they found out Vukas would have been only 16 when Georgette was murdered.
Oh, wow. So probably too young to be involved.
That's what they thought.
Yeah.
And not long after, he was actually acquitted of the other murder charge. So that lead fizzled out pretty quickly.
Another dead end. Man, it's like every time they got close, the trail went cold.
It's frustrating.
Totally. And it makes you appreciate just how difficult it is to solve these cold cases, especially when so much time has passed.
Yeah. It's like trying to piece together a broken mirror. You might have some of the fragments, but the image they once reflected is, it's gone.
Perfectly put. And so the case of Georgette Bauerdorf went cold. Despite all the evidence, the suspects, the investigation, no answers.
No answers. But her case wasn't entirely forgotten. Years later, rumors started circulating about a possible link to another notorious Hollywood murder.
Are you talking about the Black Dahlia?
Yeah, the murder of Elizabeth Short.
Wow, that's a huge case. It's like it's become part of Hollywood legend.
Right. One of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. And some people believe that there might be a connection between the two cases.
Really? What makes them think that?
Well, the main suspect in the Black Dahlia case, a guy named George Hodel, he had medical training and access to surgical equipment,
Okay, I'm listening.
including the type of elastic bandage that was used to strangle Georgette.
Right, right. I remember that detail from the autopsy report. It's definitely an eerie thought that the same person could be responsible for both of these crimes.
It is. It is. But there isn't any concrete evidence to actually link him to Georgette's murder.
So it's a possibility, but a slim one.
Yeah. I mean, the Black Dahlia case itself is still officially unsolved, so we're really in the realm of speculation here.
Right.
We can't say for sure if there's a connection, but we can't rule it out either.
And it's interesting because while there are some similarities, the Black Dahlia case was, well, it was much more brutal, much more about spectacle.
Yeah, you're right. Almost like the killer wanted to make a statement.
Exactly. Whereas Georgette's murder felt, I don't know, more personal somehow.
Yeah. Maybe more about the specific circumstances of her life, the people she chose to trust.
It's a subtle distinction, but I think an important one.
Yeah, I agree.
It makes you think, though, could there be other unsolved murders from that era, you know? Cases with similar patterns or connections that we're just missing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating, if slightly unsettling thought.
It is. It's like we're trying to put together this puzzle, but we're missing some crucial pieces.
Right, and we may never have the complete picture, and that's part of what makes these cold cases so compelling, you know.
Oh, absolutely. They force us to confront the limits of our knowledge and to accept that some questions may never be answered.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean we should stop searching for the truth. It makes you think, right, about how those attitudes, about women especially, might have influenced the investigation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about the power dynamics of Hollywood and the culture of secrecy. But back then, a young woman like Georgette, who was known for being generous to servicemen, she might have been seen as, well, naive or even an easy target.
Yeah. Her kindness, sadly, might have worked against her.
It's possible, and it's something we have to keep in mind when we look at these older cases. We have to view them through the lens of the time,
Right.
understanding those social norms and expectations that, well, that might have been overlooked back then.
Makes you wonder if there are other cases,
Yeah.
you know, from that era that were dismissed or maybe not fully investigated because of those biases.
That's a good point. I mean, we've seen even recently how cold cases have been reopened.
Mm.
And with new eyes, new technology, it leads to breakthroughs. Sometimes it even exposes injustices that were, just swept under the rug.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Georgette's story, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that Georgette Bauerdorf, she was more than just a victim, more than just a name in a case file. She was a real person with hopes and dreams, a life full of potential, and that life was cut tragically short. So her story, it deserves to be remembered.
Beautifully said. And it's a reminder that even with all the unanswered questions, even after all this time, the search for justice shouldn't stop.
Right. It's a call to action for all of us, I think, to be more aware, to look out for each other, and to never give up on the pursuit of the truth.
If any detail about Georgette's story, anything at all, sparked a memory for you or maybe gave you a new idea about what might have happened, please reach out to us. You never know. Your insight could be the missing piece.
Exactly.
And for all of you true crime fans out there, if you're enjoying these deep dives, make sure you're subscribed to The Deep Dive for more stories like this.
We've got plenty more mysteries to explore.
We do. Until next time, stay curious, listeners, and never stop searching for those answers.